you're uncomfortable with that. So you should have all received the notification about that. And we'll just give it another minute as people are coming in. Helen, can you keep an eye on the waiting room?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. We can take turns clicking to see who goes first. Who can be fastest. Okay, well, welcome everyone. We might get started just because it's we only have an hour and a half, and there's a lot of interesting things to talk about. So welcome to this workshop. My name's Scott Daniel. I'm one of the members of the REEN board, and joined by some others, which I'll introduce shortly. The session today is From Concept to Completion, Writing Your Conference Paper. And we're going to be using Mentimeter. And so just while we're getting underway, I'll put this message in the chat, and you should be able to log into, you should be able to click on this link and then be able to see the Mentimeter there. Let me just get us going. Just give me 1 second.
While Scott's just doing admin.
Yes, I'm doing some admin in the background.
We have 50 people joined, and we're expecting another probably 50 to 70. So that's why we're just going a little bit slowly at the beginning.
Okay, so let's get going. And for those of you who have just joined, this meeting is being recorded. So feel free to turn off your video, or if you're uncomfortable with being recorded, we will share the recording later. So welcome to this session. What we're suggesting is that if you can go to Menti and join using either the QR code on the screen, if you want to scan that with your phone, or if you go to menti.com and enter that code. I'll put the code in the chat. It's 7582 4520. Try not to make any typos. And I can see there's 8 people there. If you're on the same screen, if you're on the same device, you can just click that link that's in the chat right now. I can see 11 people are there, so just we'll keep that QR code will come up on the screen from time to time, and please join, because we're interested in first of all just checking in to see where people are dialing in from. And for Hester, who's just commented in the chat, it's great to have you here. We have about half of the attendees who've registered are coming to REES, but half aren't. So I think there's still value in attending to with the content that we'll cover. And yeah, as Teresa said, everyone is most welcome. So you should have a screen that comes up like this. So you can click where you're dialing in from and hit submit. And then when you look back on the shared screen, you can see where everyone's coming in from. So it's wonderful to have so many different continents and countries represented. I'm dialing in from Sydney, and wonderful to see people from all over the world. Okay, great to have everyone here. And I'm sure that we've got some multiple languages in our group. So we can, we've got some Spanish, some Romanian, I think, some English. Wonderful to have you. And there's some Aussie slang coming in there as well. Excellent. Oh, it's really very nice to see the different languages. I don't actually recognize what all the languages are, but salam alaikum. And we just wanted to like get a sense of what your interest is in this workshop. So it's focused on from concept to completion, but take a moment to tell us where you're at. Is that opening?
Yeah, it's open, Scott.
Okay, thank you.
Just takes people a little bit longer to type.
Yeah, no, I was just getting mixed messages on my screen. Yeah, so just take a moment to think about what you're hoping to get out of today's session.
I've got a message saying that voting is closed. Please wait or ask the presenter to open voting. So I don't know whether that's just me.
I think you might, so that's what I was getting confused about before. You might just have to refresh your screen where you're responding. Is that working, Anne?
Can you turn off the countdown, Scott? There's a countdown running. Thank you.
So if we look at so I think we've got some interesting learning more about strategies. Interdisciplinary. So that's very interesting. Advice on getting an idea from an idea to a paper, to learn about conference papers. My first journal paper, that's very exciting. Learning something new. I hope that will come. Did any of the other facilitators want to comment on any of the? So some great ideas there, and I hope we've only got an hour and a half, and I hope to get to as many of those as we can.
I see some great comments. I think that we're going to be addressing some of these. The higher level difference between a theoretical and conceptual framework is not going to happen in this workshop. This is focused at people writing their first paper or their first conference proceedings, but hopefully being part of this conversation will still be helpful.
Yeah, we'll do the best that we can, and we're also hoping to have some further workshops later this year. So we'll do what we can in the time that we have, and then we'll also be humble about what we can get through. So thanks for giving us a snapshot of who's in the room, and I want to introduce the REEN workshop team. So each of them are on the screen, and it's really great to have them all here. And in particular, I wanted to introduce Teresa and Helen, who are both dialing in from South Africa, and they'll be taking over from the next section. So I might hand over to the two of you.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome everyone. It's really lovely to see everybody here. There's been a lot of planning behind the scenes on this, and it's really great to see it all come together. I'm going to be leading the first section, so I'll jump straight in, and then Helen, I'm sure, will chat to you in a bit when she takes over. So I'm Teresa, as Scott said, and I'm from South Africa. I'm on the REEN board, which is how I'm involved in this, and we really decided to run a workshop that enables people to think about their research papers, specifically for our REES conference, which is coming up, but really for any conference paper or first journal paper, as Scott has said. And for many people that are new to engineering education research, or what people call SOTL, Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, it is quite a journey, actually, to get from often technical discipline-specific research, which Helen will chat about in a bit, to thinking about how we can apply theory, as many of you have mentioned, and literature, and developing a research study in a discipline that you're a little bit more unfamiliar with. So this slide shows you a really useful model that describes Scholarship of Teaching and Learning by Trigwell, and we'll share the resources with you afterwards, although the link to the article is at the bottom there. And it really talks about 3 dimensions, which are the informed, reflection, and communication. So when people start out on this journey, they're generally using informal theories of teaching and learning. They kind of have informal, perhaps even unfocused reflection on their practice in the classroom. And they may be engaging with some published literature on general teaching and learning. And then as you start to think about your teaching practice, you'll find you start to have informal discussions with colleagues, in the coffee room, or, just in general meetings that you might have around trying to reflect on what's really happening in the classrooms, and maybe start attending some workshops or training. And as you progress down kind of to a more scholarly approach to teaching and learning, then you can start to engage more with published literature, specifically in engineering, teaching and learning. And that can be quite useful because people in engineering education research tend to have been on the same journey that perhaps you've been on. So that can be quite useful. And then you can start to reflect in action. So when you're actually in your classroom, you're starting to reflect on what's happening, start asking yourself questions around what's happening. And I think that's how many of us end up submitting our first conference paper, is based on the reflection that happened in a classroom, or we did something in a classroom, an intervention, and we want to reflect on, did it work? And that can be quite a challenging jump, which Helen will talk about in a bit. And then you can start to present at local national conferences. And I think that's when many of us begin, and then start to get really into scholarship of teaching and learning, which is, really being informed by the literature, doing formal reflection in classroom, which you can translate to research in practice, and start to publish in international conference proceedings and journals. So this is quite a useful model. And what we're going to ask you to do on the next slide is we're going to first ask you to tell us, do you have any questions about this model? And then on the next slide, we're going to actually ask you to think about where you fit. But for now, if you can maybe just pop in your Menti question if you have any questions.
Yeah, if you're on a phone, you're going to have to scroll down to get to the question box. So you're going to see a big white, the picture at the top and a big white column. And if you scroll down, then you can get to the question box.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So we'll just give you a few minutes to comment on that model.
So we're seeing theories coming up.
Now, so theories is often something that you may even see in your reviewer feedback, which we'll chat about a bit later as well. But theories, kind of how theories inform what we do, is a very core component of transitioning into the scholarship of teaching and learning space. And I think Helen's going to pick up on that right now after these slides. Okay, cool. So I'm thinking people are probably still absorbing what the model is about, and also probably getting used to Mentimeter a bit. Yeah, and I think this is a really great question here. How to write formal reflection that translates into action research practice. So that's exactly why we're here today, is to that reflection that's happening in the classroom, those questions that you're asking, how do you turn that into some kind of research article? And then I also see there's a good question around how do we validate our own reflection and students' reflection? And yes, it's a different research space. And Helen's going to talk a bit now about also consensus in research and what that means, specifically for many of us being discipline-specific researchers in the sciences, which are really positivist and kind of used to laboratory work and one right answer.
And for those who don't know, positivist is an education word, or it's a social sciences word that means believing that there's a right answer. broadly. The education, social science people can correct me.
Yeah. Okay, good. I think, Scott, I think we can carry on. I think this is some good engagements. So what we're going to ask you now is, understanding this model or having a little bit of an overview of the model, if you can maybe just take your cursor in Menti and place it on where you feel you fit at the moment, remembering that at the top of the diagram is kind of just getting into the space, and towards the bottom of the diagram is now where you really feel like you're an engaged scholarship, kind of a teaching, learning practitioner, moving in even into that engineering education research space, perhaps.
And just to be clear, there's no right place to be in this space. Some people choose to remain focused in the top half of that space, being reflective teachers talking about their teaching, but they're not interested in doing research. Some people really want to be doing the research. And so there isn't a right place to be.
Yeah, absolutely, Helen, you're very right. So I see it's quite a nice spread, and I also think it's interesting how most people put their dots in the reflection column, because I think that's where it all starts, right? Is in us reflecting, in us being observing the challenges that we have in the classroom and wanting to fix them, kind of being those problem solvers that many of us are trained to be.
And this exercise itself is a reflective exercise to think about, you know, where we are and how we think about our teaching. So it's reflecting on reflection.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I might move to the next.
I think it's over to you now, Helen, if I'm correct. Yeah.
Okay. So this is in the first part of the talk. We're going to be, I mean, we've done some introduction, but the first kind of main component is we're going to think about what the differences are between technical research and educational research. We're going to think in particular about what kind of research questions we ask. We're going to talk about high or low consensus, and I'll explain what those mean in a little bit. We're going to talk about transferability of results. And these are three key differences between technical research and educational research. And once I learned about these differences, it really helped me to unlock what I was doing wrong when I was trying to apply my technical research skills to educational research, and what I needed to change in the way I thought about research. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So if you can just let us know where you've been in the past between the technical and education research, and where you'd like to be in the future. And some people, I'm aware, are not education researchers, but social science researchers. So then we're just going to interpret education broadly as including the social sciences. So I think what we're seeing here is people have done a mix from only technical research to only education research in the past, but most are mixed, and most would like to be more focused on education research in the future, and that's why you're here. So that's helpful for us to understand, and I think that was our expectation of this audience. But let's go on and think about what the differences are. So the first difference between technical and educational research is the kind of research questions we ask. So in technical research, we have been trained to ask how much questions or yes, no questions. We often have a null hypothesis and we must prove that the hypothesis is or is not correct. So, and quite often the first question that a technically trained researcher wants to ask about their teaching, and I certainly was like this, is how can I prove that the way I teach in my classroom is the best way to teach? Or how can I measure the way I'm teaching in my classroom and measure the changes that we're making? So I want to know how much change does it make if I do this, or does it work or does it not? And the fact is that those questions are really impossible to ask or impossible to answer in the educational space, because we're not now dealing with nice, well-behaved materials or electrons. We're dealing with humans, and humans are learning animals. And so it's not possible to quantify those things. So the kinds of questions that we're asking in the education space are, why does this intervention work? Or in what ways does it work? Or for who does it work? How does project-based learning help students or hinder students? So we're trying to understand the mechanisms. We're trying to be curious about the deeper understanding. And those how and why questions allow us to capture the nuance, the variation of our students or of ourselves, our participants in our study. So some of them will do better in an environment and some of them will do worse. And by asking how and why and who, we're capturing that a little bit better. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is about consensus. And so that's why there's that lovely picture at the top of people arguing. So a technical field in our training, and Teresa used the word positivist before, and a high consensus field is really where we can be positivist, I think, though I'm happy for any of the more experienced educational people to correct me. But when we were doing our undergraduate studies in engineering, we're in a high consensus field. So everyone agrees about the core theoretical framework. We're using Kirchhoff's law to analyze the flow of electrons in a circuit. We're using Newton's laws of motion. And unless I'm traveling at the speed of light, Newton's laws of motion are pretty good, at or near to the speed of light. And so I don't say I'm using Newton's law of gravitation. I just say the gravitational constant is. And so as scientists and engineers, we tend to be a little bit blind to the theories we're using because we just assume that everyone else is using the same theories. Whereas when we come into educational research, we're in a low consensus field. There are a huge diversity of theories. And so we must be explicit upfront about the theoretical frameworks that we're relying on. I can take the same set of data and analyze it. If I put on my gender glasses and analyze it using one of the gender theories, such as critical feminism, I will find a set of results out of that data, which we will argue about. If I take off my gender glasses and put on my project-based learning glasses, I will find a different set of information out of that data. So, and that's a very loose understanding of theory, but it helps to think about the lenses, the glasses that we're looking through, because everyone, the data is not, there is not an objective answer. There is a trustworthy answer, which I can get to, but it relies on the theory that I've built it on. And I had a first supervision meeting yesterday with a new engineering education student, and she said, so no one will, so is there a right or a wrong theory to use? What theory can I use so that no one will argue with you? And we're like, no, you don't understand. Everyone will always argue with you about the theory that you use. That's the point. But so that thinking about theory as something that isn't fixed really helps you to understand what you're reading in the literature and helps you to think about how to frame it. Okay, next slide, please. And finally, we're talking about transferability. So in scientific research, if I measure the gravitational constant in my laboratory, and I report all the relative contextual details, like what the altitude is and what the temperature was on the day I measured it, I don't know if that matters, then that result is transferable to anywhere else with the same context. I don't even have to measure the gravitational constant. I can just use reported values in the literature. But if I apply a teaching method in my class, there is no similar context. Even the same module the following year is not the same context because I'm different, the students are different. Perhaps we have COVID and we're teaching online. Perhaps now we're back from COVID and we're teaching high flex. The students have grown up with different smartphones. So the context does not remain the same, even if I control everything. It is impossible to get the same context. And so we can't transfer knowledge in the same way we can scientifically, but we must ask broader questions that allow the research we're doing to have value outside of our own classroom. It's valuable in my classroom to me and perhaps to my co-teacher. But for it to be valuable in the literature, it must have some transferability. It must ask some broader questions than just, did this work in my context? Okay. So that was quite a lot of theory, but if this is a good time to ask questions in the chat, and we're also asking you just to compare, just to identify where you think these fields fit in terms of consensus and the number of interpretations. So go ahead and vote. So these are all the different votes we've had, and there's a question about results in education research versus engineering research. And this does require you to read. I'm going to perhaps ask if Teresa also wants to chime in on this, but it's going to depend on the theory and the methods that you've used. So if you've done a quantitative study, then your results might look like statistical tables. If you've done a qualitative study, then your results might look like student narratives or quotes that you've interpreted. But that's at a very basic level. I don't know if Teresa, if you would like to chime in.
No, thanks.
Okay.
And I was going to, maybe we're going to talk about it a little bit later, and maybe we can come back to that question at the end, because it depends on that, what you said at the end of the previous slide. What is the research question, which we're going to get to, kind of what are you trying to understand, or what is the thing that you're trying to get more information on? And as a result, your results will line up with that, is based on what the purpose of the study is.
Okay, so the point of this is partly just for us to understand that there's quite a lot of difference between the technical research we're used to doing and we were trained in if we're trained as engineers, and the educational research we're trying to learn how to do. And that difference is going to have shown up in the reviews that you have received on abstracts that you have submitted. So quite a lot of people here have received feedback on their abstracts for REES. And just a reminder that the full papers are due September 6th. So you have a little bit of time. That's why we scheduled this session now. So you have a little bit of time to implement the feedback. Other people might not have a paper that they're currently working on, but maybe they've previously had experience. I know the first paper I submitted to REES, in fact, is a version of that paper is the sample abstract we have for later. And it had a lot of reviewer comments that I did not understand. I did not know how to respond to them. So any reviewer feedback that you've got, this is a great place to put that. So I see there's a comment from a reviewer saying there's a disconnect between the claim and the evidence. And we're definitely going to be talking about that. How do you respond to reviewers who say the sample number is too small when you are doing a qualitative study? I think that's a higher level question. And so Teresa is answering in the chat. But so the cycle of action research is not enough, should be more than 3 cycles. So we're getting questions about methodology. And remember, we said this is a low consensus field. So one of the things that is different is that people who work primarily in quantitative want larger sample sizes and aren't always familiar with appropriate sample sizes for qualitative studies. So that's about the people are going to argue with you about your theories. So you find a paper to cite to demonstrate that this is an appropriate number of. There's a disconnect between the themes and the research objectives. So we're finding that there's comments on methodology, there's comments on a connection between the research question and the findings or conclusions. There's Scott, if you can just zoom in on the comment down in the bottom left. How to address when 2 different reviewers want to have their queries answered in the paper, and perhaps they disagree with each other. These are common. So Teresa has also answered about the statistical analysis, which was asked in the chat.
Maybe, Helen, if I could just also add, because something we will talk about a little bit later is the limitations of your study. And sometimes it's important to scope your study in such a way that the purpose is clear, that the scope is clear, and that, as Helen said, you're never going to solve the entire world's problems in your paper. So sometimes it's just around creating a boundary around what your study is actually trying to achieve and what it's not trying to achieve, and what the limitations are. So I think that also helps you to address some of the questions around sample size, the 3 cycles of the action research. It depends what the purpose is and what you're trying to, especially when you're presenting a conference paper on work that's not complete yet. So sometimes you're doing a big study and you may be presenting pieces of it as you go along. So it's just around trying to create a boundary around the piece you're doing now and making sure that that purpose is clear, and that you then also describe what's coming next and what future work will do in that space.
Great, thanks, Teresa. If we can go to the next slide. Teresa?
Okay,
oh,
cool.
this is me.
Sorry.
No, sorry, this is me. Moment of uncertainty. So I think we've seen quite a lot of this already in the previous slide, but this is quite common reviewer feedback. Where did we get this feedback from? Teresa and I went and looked at all the reviews we've done this year, and we pulled out common themes. and other reviewers will recognize it. So the first one is the scope of the study is too broad and it doesn't have a clear focus. And so that's when you're trying to answer the big question. How can I make students succeed? You can't answer that question. How can I identify student success and understand student success in this population on this date? That's a question you can answer, potentially. So when I started, I said to someone that the problem was that all the questions I came up with either too big to answer or too small to be interesting. And so it's about learning to ask the right size of question that you can answer and have interesting. The study should engage with existing literature. This is a big part of what happens is because you might be on your own in your research group, on your own in your department doing this, you feel like you're on your own in the whole world doing this. The study that you are doing on student success or on mentorship or on project-based learning feels critically important to you, and it feels like no one else is doing it. But I guarantee you someone else is doing it. And so you need to read that existing literature, and part of reading that literature, which Teresa will come to, can give you the theory and the methods that are appropriate to use. So it gives you information about how to answer that question as well. But you must engage with the existing literature to show that that you understand what else has been done. And outside of your department, in the big world, other people are doing things. Next. This is a very common one. So people write about a project and they have the outcomes of the project, but the paper is not the same as the project. So the project wants to understand this or wants to develop a new course. The paper does not want to develop a new course. The paper is explaining what we learned when we developed a new course or what we want to improve the next time we do it. So the outcomes of the paper and the outcomes of the project are different. Next. What research question is the paper asking? And that goes back to the scope of the study. The clear focus is that research question, which you should try and make narrow and answerable to the best of your ability. Insufficient details of how the data was collected and analyzed. So quite often you're quite excited because you've got a methodology. You're going to use qualitative analysis, but you need to add information about, you need to add much more information about methods. Who did you sample? How many did you sample? How did you choose them? What was the method of analysis? Did you use an existing lens? Did you use deductive or inductive coding, for example? So there's a whole lot of details about participants, about data and collection, data analysis, data processing, and interpretation of results that needs to be in your methods as well. The limitations of the study are not acknowledged or discussed. And this is where Teresa's answer to the idea of you only did one action cycle and you're supposed to do 3 action cycles. Then you say this is a pilot study. And in this study, we've just done 1 action cycle, but we understand that we need to go through and do the cycle a couple of more times for it to be valid, for it to have wider transferability. Scott's asking, what are some examples of limitations you might acknowledge? So perhaps think about that if you want to put them in the chat. And the conclusions are not supported by the data. So that was one that came up. So the conclusions, you need to be really clear that your conclusions aren't what you wished you could have got to, but what you actually found. And it needs to line up with what is shown in your data. Okay. Oh, and the story is not clear to the reader. Sorry. This coming in one by one is great, but it's very unpredictable. because Scott's driving the Mentee and I'm responding to it. So your paper, a good paper should tell a story. This is always true, even in technical research. It's more true, I feel, in it. One of the things I like about education research is that my papers feel more like stories, and it's easier to write a story than the story that I write about my finite element code. But there still needs to be a clear thread through. So that story being clear is also about all the bits being connected and feeling like they belong in the same paper.
Helen, can I pick this up? Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
go ahead.
We're now, so we've chatted about some kind of placing SOTL and engineering education research in context, and we've spoken a little bit about review of feedback. And now we're going to go into some details of the elements of a good practice-based paper. So if you could just go to the Mentee, and here we've just included a few sections that should be in a paper, kind of some of the common sections of a paper. And if you can just select the order in which these elements of a paper should be. So first, what is the first section that you would expect to see in a paper versus what is the last section that you would expect to be in a paper? Are these the results now, Scott, on the screen? Yeah, okay, cool. I see them.
Yeah, they're starting to shift as different people submit. Don't take any peer pressure, respond with whatever you think is right. I should have hidden the results until people, actually I can hide them. You let me know when you want to unhide them, Teresa. There's 22 people that responded so far.
Just going to give another minute. Okay.
I'll make it 10 seconds just so we can move along. Oops.
So let's show the results. Good. So I see generally people put the conclusion at the end and the findings before that, then the methods, and then the literature review and the research question first. So it is, I mean, I've had much debate around these kinds of things in the past with people, but typically it's not a bad thing to start, is to start with kind of your research, with your literature, to actually enable you to refine your research question. So sometimes if you're a very experienced researcher who's kind of got their handle on the literature, they're very well read and they can kind of pull authors and ideas from literature all the time, it's perhaps easier for them to formulate a research question without reading literature. But for many of us who are starting out, I think sometimes reading literature is the best place to start thinking about a research question. I know when I started my PhD, my first supervisor, I went into their office and I was super enthusiastic with all my wonderful ideas. And they told me, you need to go away and do some reading. And I was broken, like absolutely disheartened by this experience. Like I didn't want to do reading. I wanted to get stuck into the research, but it was really good advice. I think we can learn a lot from reading literature, as Helen's kind of already mentioned.
And I think also it's important to read the literature, but also in terms of how you tell the story in your paper, to kind of set a broad scene. And we'll actually look at this kind of model later on, but setting a broad scene by saying, these are some of the big issues in this area of engineering education. And then this is the particular question that I'm focusing on. So it gives it a kind of a narrative flow to set the scene and then focus in on the particular angle that you're looking at in the paper.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, absolutely. And as Helen said, you know, maybe this is a research question you have and you thought you're the only person in the world that has it. But when you go and read some literature, you find that other people have a similar question, which maybe reinforces the kind of reason or motivation for your study. Or perhaps you find that someone's answered the question, but in a different context, perhaps. And then maybe your research question changes a little and you can say, well, this research question was answered and these were the results, but in my context, I'm not necessarily sure that that will be the answer in my context, and maybe your research question changes a little bit. So this is kind of the suggested process, and we'll talk about the funnel that Scott referred to right at the end, but this is sort of the process that we would recommend when you're setting out on doing a good practice-based paper. To start with that literature review, which will inform your research question, and the literature will also help to inform your methods and how people present findings. So somebody asked a question, how do you present findings in a paper like this? A great place to find out how people present findings is to go and read some literature and see, here's a paper that does lots of quantitative statistical analysis. How do people present it versus qualitative data? Helen, can I carry on? You're happy? Then you can pick up just now. Okay, cool. So how is literature useful? And I think we have spoken about some of these things before, but it's nice that it's now summarized in a slide, which you can maybe refer to a little bit later as well. But my supervisor once told me that a literature review enables you to listen to, understand, and then join the ongoing conversations that are taking place. So it enables you to contextualize. Lots of people are talking in literature about many things. So you kind of, in your paper, need to find a way into that conversation. And sometimes you almost need to think about it as a conversation. So picture yourself having coffee with someone, and what are the kinds of questions they would ask? What is the sort of response you would get? And if you can find in the literature that's already happening, it enables you to create that story. Okay, so as we've said, it helps you to understand what's already been done and how this can inform your study. So it may inform your study in terms of what's been done, but it can help you with your method. It can help you with your analysis. It can help you with what theoretical lens, like Helen spoke to, you can be using, which is really useful. So literature is not only about kind of that section that you write at the beginning that says what has been done on this in the past. It can inform your whole, from the beginning to the end. You can weave that literature throughout your study. Where do you find literature, which is maybe an important question when you're brand new to the field. So Scott's he's got a link there to our REEN website, actually, which has some.
I'll just quickly share some of those links. So I think Diana may have just posted it as well. So on the REEN website, there is a, so it's the same one that Diana's just posted in the chat. And it has links and information about a whole bunch of different journals. So that's a really good resource, because I'm involved with the Australasian Journal of Engineering Education. While I've got the floor, I'll just highlight that one, but all of these are, great outlets, and you might, think about where your study fits, which audience you want to speak to and which audience you want to engage with, but there's a great list there. There's also, a huge number of conferences that are really relevant as well. So in this link, and thanks for Rosalie and Anne for pointing out that AJEE is a Q1 journal. There's also these really important, really valuable resources for conference proceedings. So this is the REES proceedings from past years, and some of those have been published in special issues. And on this slide, you can see, sorry, it's not quite showing all of those there, but I'll put that in the, that's weird, isn't it? I'll put that in the chat, and as well as REES, there's a number of other conferences, and you can, raid. I think the term that Helen used was cyber stalk. So we don't encourage stalking, but there are some great conference resources online, and I've just put some of the acronyms. There's a lot of ease because of engineering and education. Cool, thanks, Teresa.
Thanks, Scott. So, and I mean, literature can be daunting. So this is kind of not the purpose of this workshop, but, you know, perhaps find a friend or a small team where you can do kind of a journal club where you can read an article and discuss it together. And we'll also share some resources afterwards, some more kind of important work on engineering education research, which can kind of help you get into the field. So this is more literature, not necessarily related to your study, but literature on how to get into the field of SOTL and engineering education research, which we will share with you, which can be very helpful. Right. So our literature now leads into our research question. And many reviewers actually look for a research question specifically. Sometimes authors kind of weave it into the purpose or the aim of the study, but many reviewers will specifically look for it. We kind of stated my research question for the study is, and for someone who's new to the field, it's a very, it's kind of advisable to do that, to think what is the research question I have and to actually put it in your piece of work. And then ask yourself, think about the evidence that you're going to be collecting. What is evidence? Evidence is your data. So are you going to do interviews? Are you going to analyze a survey? Are you going to be reporting on your own personal reflection? But what data are you going to be collecting? And then ask yourself, as a scientist, because a lot of us are scientists, just like we would do in a laboratory, can that data answer this question, right? And although your research question should inform your method, there is a bit of a loop there. So maybe you want to think about the data you've decided to collect and think, is it really going to enable me to answer that question, or do I need to tweak that question a little bit in terms of scope, in terms of context, because this will really, it's kind of the heart of your entire study, and guides should guide your method and the conclusions that are drawn. And also something to keep in mind, if you're asking a question that can be answered yes or no, you're not really asking what Helen described as a what or why question. So try and phrase your question in a way that you can't answer yes or no, that you need to answer in kind of descriptive paragraphs, because then you're more asking those what and why questions. And I think Helen's going to pick up from the next points.
But please do, if you do have any, speaking of questions, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we can, you know, address them as we go.
So we're talking about methodology and methods, and these again come from the research question that you proposed. The methodology and methods, I think I understand the difference. I'm still also learning, so I'm on this journey with you. But methodology is the broad approach, I think, and the methods are the particulars of how you implement in your context. So the methodology I might be using is a quantitative methodology, and the methods are, I'm going to do a rush analysis. Do I have it the wrong way around? Anyway, so I'm going to do an ANOVA on my statistical data. That starts to be the methods. I'm going to have this many participants. I'm going to have, so they enable you to collect data that can act as evidence for the conclusions. So you have to have an appropriate methodology. If I want to ask, I say to my students all the time, if I want to ask whether people like chocolate chip cookies or peanut butter cookies better, there had better be some cookies that people eat as part of my study, right? That has to be connected. If we can go to the next, and then the method should be described in sufficient detail to ensure the scientific integrity of the study. And what we really mean by this is that, first of all, someone else can check your method. And that's why reviewers will say, you don't have enough participants, you don't have a big enough sample size. And in quantitative, that really matters, because if you don't have a big enough sample size, you can't draw conclusions. But it also means that someone else could replicate your study. They could say, oh, I read this paper, it was fascinating, I want to try that with my students. And there should be enough detail that they can replicate your study in their context pretty well. So it needs to be explained in enough detail that someone else could go tread that same path. So then we come to the findings, and the findings, again, must align with the research question. So the research question really is the anchor. And just a reminder, we all know that you write the introduction first, and then you write it last. So you write the research question first, and then you do your study, and then sometimes your research question needs to be refined because it turned out that your research question was too big and your study data doesn't answer that. So the research question isn't carved in stone when you start your study. It's something that evolves, but it needs to, your findings need to align with the research question so that the person reading your paper can say they tried to ask this. Yes, they've done the right method. Yes, these are the findings. These findings are appropriate for that research question.
Yeah.
There's a question about gathering evidence rather than proof. Yeah, we can't prove any. I would be very suspicious of anyone who could prove something in education research. We talk about evidence and we talk about trustworthiness rather than validity quite often. There's a question about systematic literature review in engineering education research. In fact, systematic literature review and scoping review are quite popular methods now in engineering education research, and Scott's just put in a paper for you to look at about that. Next bullet, please. And again, the findings, they must align with the research question, but they must also be based on the evidence that was collected. So we can't find things that we didn't report on. And the last bullet, and I see there's quite a lot of questions, but then it's, yeah, go ahead, Teresa.
Trustworthiness. So maybe we can just chat about how do you measure trustworthiness?
And how do you know that the findings
mean?
So when we're talking about trustworthiness, we want to ensure we understand in education research that it is much more subjective than technical research. The researcher plays a larger role. But when we talk about trustworthiness, we want to take steps to make sure that our biases aren't changing the results. And we can't remove our biases. But one way to do this is to have two different people. So if you're doing a qualitative study, have two different people code the data separately. In a systematic literature review, you need to decide on inclusion or exclusion. Have two different people separately decide and then discuss. And that's called triangulation. So that means you're not just doing it on your own by yourself, but you're comparing with other people and you're allowing arguments. And that's one way of ensuring trustworthiness. Another way is to analyzing data until you find no new findings. So we can get to saturation, where we see that even if we add more data, it doesn't change the findings. And so that's a way of saying that this is valid. Teresa, did I answer? And how do we know that the findings are genuine? I think this question comes out of partly we have to change our mindset. So this is part of moving from technical to discipline to education research, is that we have less control. We cannot control all the variables. We cannot prove something absolutely. So we need to think about trustworthiness. We need to be aware that we have bias, and we need to take steps to eliminate our bias where possible and to acknowledge our bias. So a lot of papers now include a positionality statement. So I say, I am a white South African woman writing from a settler colonial state, which means that I have a certain positionality, or I might have a positionality as a technically trained researcher venturing into qualitative research, which means that I look at the results in a certain way. So you can't eliminate, you can't prove things, you can't eliminate bias, but you can be honest about it. And that's what we mean when we say trustworthy. Teresa, I see there's also a long online discussion happening about systematic literature reviews and literature reviews. I don't know if we want to quickly capture that.
Some good resources posted, but remember that systematic literature review is a source of data, right? So depending on the question you ask, based on that question, you may decide that the best source of data is literature, right? And your question will then align with that, and you define your whole collection of data from literature to align with that. But as Diana mentioned, a systematic literature review should not be confused with a literature review. So your literature review comes at the start, enables you to define your research question, and then based on your research question, you may then in your method choose your source of data is not focus groups, it could be but one source of data will be the literature, because there is something you want to know about the literature. What is the literature talking about, or what are the key themes from the literature? And then you will do a systematic literature review, but they're not really the same thing.
And Scott's been posting lots of resources in the chat, just to reassure you,
like dumping them in
all
there,
of these
so
resources afterwards.
Yeah, we'll distill some things from the chat to make it easier to find. But the paper from, I think it's Grant and Booth, that talks about different types of reviews is actually a helpful one. But I think, I mean, that as I commented, that can be its own study in its own right. So there just was one question that I think I wanted to pick up on, that is from a little bit ago. So I'm just scrolling back in the thing about how how to actually go about writing the paper. And now I can't find it. Oh yeah, here it is. It's from, it was at 5:58 p.m. so 5 minutes ago. And just asking about which way to write a paper, about whether to write it sequentially or to write the findings followed with other sections. I was wondering if Teresa or Helen, if you had any comments on that one. I can post it again.
Yeah, I was also intrigued by that, Scott, because I don't think I've ever seen a paper that starts with the findings, so maybe somebody else needs to.
I think, I don't know if the question is about how the paper should be presented or how you should go about the process of writing it. Quite often you start. Sorry?
It says how it's structured. So one way is to, I see your approach, right? Okay, I understand now. So it's not about how it's written up. It's about how you work through the process. Okay. Yeah, carry on.
So, I mean, in terms of the process, you do it in whatever order and you do all things all over. In terms of your findings are your key findings are going to be in your abstract. Your key conclusions are going to be in your abstract, but you don't want to kind of you don't want to give away the secret before the end of the paper. So it can feel like you haven't done anything if your introduction includes all your findings. If the first part of the section is the findings, then the reader might feel like that was old, that wasn't the work you did. So you do some positioning of the paper with perhaps some findings or the kind of things we're looking for, the themes that we identified. You might put that in the introduction because it helps to position the paper. But it can be quite risky to put the findings first, because then the reviewer can feel like you haven't actually in the end found anything. I think Diana's making a good point. Think about contribution rather than findings. So you put your contribution in the introduction, and then the findings are evidence of that contribution. Okay,
Yeah.
I think we can move on.
Helen, just to add, because I think it is a risk sometimes when people are doing reflective studies in classrooms, is I think it is a risk to just randomly collect some data in your class, like just do a survey and then try and work. I mean, it can work, but to try and then work backwards and think, well, what would the research question have been that related to the survey I did, or what would the literature have been that informed the survey? And I think that's often what happens in that very first practice paper people write, is that they did something in class and now they're trying to write it up as a study. And it is much, much easier to do it the other way around, to read the literature, think about your research question, and then plan your survey. So as exciting as it is to just send out a survey, it really is worth doing some homework before you do that.
It's usually rubbish. I mean, my experience of my own papers, the ones that I didn't have a research question for before I started collecting the data is unusable. So it's an iterative process. You go through each of these steps 3 or 4 times, and at different times you are doing different things. Once you've got a research question and you've collected your data, then when you start trying to write about it, it can help to write the findings first, because in fact you have to do data analysis and that leads you to your findings. And then you might want to write, but you have to, as Teresa said, you have to start with a clear idea of the gap in the literature and the research question before you collect data. And Anne is pointing out that there are ethics issues as well. So you need ethics approval to collect data from students. And usually you can't get ethics approval without showing your research question. Your research question might change, but you need to have a plan.
Just one comment that I'm thinking about as we're having this discussion is going back to that subtle framework that we discussed earlier about, reflection and being informed by the literature and reflecting, like that. For me, and I'd be interested to see what other people think, but doing research, it hasn't been like a one-off study that I've just kind of done and published and then left my hands go. It's been, I've become curious about some aspect of my teaching or curious about some aspect of my students' experience, research that, and then maybe learn some things from that or had some insights from that, but then I might tweak the study or it might open up a new direction. So for me, it's a very iterative, evolving process that's kind of my own facilitated professional development, half as a researcher and half as trying to understand my own teaching and the educational ecosystem. So it's not like one study will be perfect. It might be, this helped me understand this, but also made me question this other thing. And then that might be the seed for the next direction you take. But Helen, I might hand back to you just to finish talking through. Yeah.
Hand over to Teresa for the conclusions.
Sorry.
Okay, thanks. So I'm hoping this is going to wrap up a lot of what we've been talking about. So the conclusion should tie directly back to the research question. So don't be tempted, and here's a good kind of place where the trustworthiness can break apart, is try and keep your study tight. There may be many things, many ideas you have. Try not to make those your conclusions. The conclusions really should be, what did the research question aim to do? What was the evidence? So what did the data tell me? And align your conclusions to what the data told you, right? If you have, the problem is I always tell people, have a whiteboard in your office and all those crazy new ideas and thinking you're thinking about, put on the whiteboard for your next study. So put that maybe in a recommendations or further work. This really made me curious about something else, put that in recommendations, but be very careful about trying to use your study to prove something that you believe is right, that you never actually got data to show. So, and then generally it kind of ties into that. Don't present new data, don't bring up new things. Have a really good findings or discussion section that describes everything in detail, and then keep your conclusions as kind of a key summary, And it's also a good check then. Go back to your objectives or research question and say, what you're writing in your conclusion should link directly to that. And if it can't, think about changing your question. Okay, so we've mentioned that it really should always be based on evidence.
There's a point that Diana's made in the chat about using your ethical review board. When you're planning your study and you submit your ethics proposal to the review board, they will ask the kind of questions that will help you get, that will help you design your study. Now, I know that in different countries, there may or may not be an ethical review board at your university. And if there is not, so I think that I'm correct that a fair number of the Indian universities don't have ethics review for education studies, or perhaps not for engineering education. So it can also be helpful to, I'm in engineering, I speak to my colleague from education, she goes through her ethics board and helps me understand. So if you don't have an ethics board, some journals won't publish your paper without proof of ethical clearance. So find how you can access some ethical approval. Okay. I think we can go to the next slide.
Yeah. So I think we've had some good questions. Are there any other questions anyone would like to add? You can put in the chat or even raise your hand if you'd like.
I think we've had such great interaction during the discussion. So we were a bit worried these slides weren't interactive enough, but you have made them interactive. So thank you for being awesome.
Yeah, but if a question pops into your head, please, just pop it in the chat. Just keep them coming. Right. So this kind of last slide is, as promised, Scott alluded to it earlier, is kind of gives a really nice picture of the structure of a research paper. And actually, this is true for technical research and educational research. Is it sort of talks about this hourglass, and as you start your study, you start really a broad field, a broad problem. Generally, people start trying to solve the entire world's problems, and the trick with a study is to try, and someone once described to me it as a brick wall. You have a brick wall in front of you with many bricks, right? And together, collectively as researchers in this conversation, you need to build a wall with all those bricks. But for your study, you need to pick one brick. And that's actually generally advice for a PhD student. So that's even broader than a paper. So think about your little brick. How are you going to add your brick into this? So the kind of the narrow part of the hourglass is kind of that brick. So go from the conversation, what are all the bricks happening in the space? How does my brick relate to other bricks? And then what is my brick? And then you'll broaden out again. So then you've written all your ideas in your black book or on your whiteboard. You've picked the idea you're exploring for the study, and now you can get into the detail of that. So what's the research problem I'm addressing, and how do I go into my method? How is it different? What is my contribution, etc. So it's kind of a really useful way of thinking how paper is structured. Thanks, guys. All right. So we're going to look at an abstract now. Hopefully all of you have received the abstract that was shared in the meeting invite and via email. Maybe if you, I don't know if we can share it now, Scott, if people don't have it, but maybe just, yeah, let us know. You pop your email address, we'll send it to you. And maybe just, it's a really short abstract. So just take a few minutes. We're going to give you 5 minutes now to kind of read through it. Thinking about the things we've been speaking about, and then we're going to ask some questions and chat about it a little bit more. Helen, all right? So we're just going to we're going to sit 5 minutes now. So
we're going to go
thanks,
to the next slide.
Yeah. Please just post in the chat if you haven't got the abstract, but it should be in the calendar event, and Otherwise, I also emailed it to everyone that had registered. So please post in the chat, or you can post to me privately and I can quickly send it to you. Otherwise, we'll discuss it in a few minutes. Okay, so time is up, and I just figured out halfway through that 5 minutes that I could share a Google Doc link. So apologies for not doing that earlier. I'll just go to the next slide. And for those of you that just joined, if you can go to that link and I'll open the I've just opened the voting, so you can just give a quick feedback about how you think that how you would rate the abstract against the different components that Teresa and Helen talked through earlier. And for those of you, if anyone's having trouble seeing the abstract, I'll just share it on my screen just for the moment.
Scott, the voting is closed. I don't seem to be able to submit.
I think if you refresh.
Oh, there we go. Oh, okay.
So I think it was closed before, but I've opened it. So if it's still showing as closed, just refresh your screen and it should let you access it. So I can see a message in the chat about that. So we've had 15 responses. So perhaps I'll open it so we can view how everyone is assessing it. Drum roll, please. Helen, did you want to, or Teresa?
So
I'm
I think
let Helen do.
this is sort of a lead into the next workshop that's going to be offered. I'm going to let Scott do a little blurb for that, where we talk about how to review papers. But actually, one of the best ways to learn how to write better education research papers is to review papers, because you can see the faults in someone else's paper more easily than you can see the faults in your own. And so part of what we're doing when we're reviewing is we're also trying to give helpful feedback. So if we can go to the next slide, we're going to ask for your recommendations about how this paper could be improved, how this abstract could be improved. Or perhaps if there are kind of reviewer comments like, the problem is that the kind of reviewer comments you've received. So it doesn't just have to be suggestions for improvement, but also if there are any comments that you have. So definitely we need to position it in the literature. There's no literature review. So it makes claims about students finding dynamics courses challenging or mastery of fundamental dynamics concepts, but there's no evidence for that. Nothing about previous studies. So perhaps by looking at the concept inventory literature, we'd be able to understand the fundamental concepts. The research problem has to be reframed because it's sort of unanswerable at the moment, certainly unanswerable with the evidence that's being collected. The question is too broad. the very generic conclusion so in fact, the conclusion does what conclusions quite often do, which is when you're starting, which is it makes a conclusion that isn't supported at all by the evidence. So the teaching resources which we develop will improve student learning. There's no evidence in the paper that that will happen. There are no findings for that. This is a work in progress, so it hasn't been done yet. But so I don't know if there are other comments that I've missed there. Oh, Anne has a great comment. The fact that this is not a good abstract doesn't mean that you shouldn't come to the conference. It might mean that you really need to come to the conference and listen and engage. And a conference is actually quite a lot easier than sitting on your own and reading literature, because you get to sit next to people at lunch and ask them the questions. So connect with other researchers, find out how they do it. And in fact, one of the best conferences I ever went to was a conference where I did not have a paper, but I learned so much in those 3 days about how to think about research. And there's a really great point that the results don't measure understanding, which is what the purpose is. So if the purpose is understanding, then the findings must address understanding. So that's about those connections. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Scott.
Thanks, Helen. So we will wrap up in a moment. But just and I can see there's still some comments coming in the chat, but we just wanted to kind of touch base. This was only 90 minutes, and so we have to be humble about what we can achieve in that time. But we're interested in just what any takeaways from today's session, and I'll open the voting so you can actually type. Sorry about that. Any takeaways, anything you've learned from today? We will share the, if not the chat, we'll pick out some of the references that were cited. And share that later on along with the slides. Yeah, interesting point about terminology. It is its own discipline, and some terms, I mean, it's like in, my first degree was in physics. In physics, there's everyday language, and then we use it in a specific way, with specific nuance in a physics context, and similarly here. So structure of papers, a couple of comments on that, and community, the value of community. This is why this is part of the reason I'm in engineering education, is the value of the community. And those of you that have got your cameras on, I can see smiling faces and familiar faces as well. So that's a really important part of it. In terms of how you frame a paper, telling a story. So that hourglass model is really helpful for kind of like structuring the story. Comments in the chat about abstracts being very short. The iteration, it's an ongoing learning journey. There's no perfect solution for teaching practice or how to be inclusive in engineering education. We're all in this journey. A few more comments about stories and that difference between technical. I know for me, I came from a physics background, so it's a mind shift to come into education research. Just with the time, I might move us along. Just briefly with the personal experiences. Actually, we might come back to that one, or if I can defer to one of the facilitators to answer that question in the chat from Heinrich. Just to flag some things that are coming up. So, oops, sorry. Let me do that again. So there's the full papers that are due for those that, I think some of you, like perhaps half of you are attending the REES conference in India in early January next year. So the full papers for that are due September 6th. So we're planning a, and then those papers will go out for review, and it'll be, you may well receive an invitation to review as being one of the, members of this community. So keep an eye out for that. I mean, looking back at the feedback that we gave on that draft abstract, a lot of it was saying, you do this better, do this better, do this better. But it's also important to recognize the strengths. So taking a strengths-based approach to reviewing, to recognize this was done really well. This is a really important study, as well as what can be done better. In the email I sent out, there was some research training opportunity. That's not through REEN, but we thought it was a timely opportunity to share, and there's more information in the email that I sent, or you can follow that link, which I'll just quickly put in the chat. So that's the link in the chat, is the one for the to register for that protocol research training. But yes, thank you so much. It's been a delight to spend this hour and a half with you, and best wishes in getting your papers together. And we'll hopefully see you at REES or some other conference in the near future, or perhaps the reviewing workshop in a few months. So thank you everyone, and thanks to the nice comments in the chat, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks everyone, bye.
Thank you.